Our scripture passage this morning is from Micah 6, verses 6 to 8. With what shall I come before the Lord and bow myself before God on high? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000s of rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? He has told you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God?
Our text for today is very familiar to us, and you've already heard it many times as well. It is simple. It is concise. It easily fits on our bulletin cover. It could easily fit on a bumper sticker. And it easily fits on the back of our church t-shirts, right? So many of you have been wearing these words for several years now. You have literally been carrying them with you. So what does the Lord require of you? To do justice, love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. At a time when our attention spans are shrinking, we may well benefit from catchy creeds or statements that articulate the fullness of our faith in the length of a text message. These few words give a concise summary of how we are to live. They offer us a way to relate to our neighbors. They are the Reader's Digest version of what God expects from us. And we can easily remember them and carry them with us. Do justice, love kindness, walk humbly with your God. However, the danger of their simplicity, of their familiarity, and of their catchiness is that we forget that they are more than just nice words. These words are meant to be lived out. The prophet spoke these words not so we could easily remember them or repeat them, but because they carry the weight of what God wants for God's people. The purpose of these words is not that we become skilled in talking the talk, but that we become skilled in walking the walk. Not just carrying those words on our backs, but living them out in our daily walk. The prophet Micah himself warns of the danger and the judgment that follows a community that is able to talk the talk, but unable to walk the walk. During the 8th century, when Micah was critiquing his faith community in their exclusive attention to the religious practices without the ethical obedience to the faith that God requires. In this text, we see this question asked, well, what shall we come before the Lord and bow ourselves down before God on high? And then we have this escalating list of potential offerings, burnt offerings, calves a year old, thousands of rams, 10,000s of rivers of oil, and even my firstborn. And Micah's answer to this, of course, is that none of these symbols of sacrifice pleases God when they are stripped from concrete actions in how we relate to one another. God desires more than empty words. God desires justice that is measured how well the most vulnerable fare in our community. God desires a loyal love that reflects the kind of loyal love and mercy that God has shown to the people of Israel. God desires careful walking in one's daily life. Micah's judgment was that the community's worship and liturgical practices needed to be accompanied by acts of justice and mercy in their relationships with those that they lived amongst. And what he saw was acts of injustice. The poor being taken advantage by the rich and those in power. Micah was from a small village, and he spoke for the poor farm workers who were suffering at the hands of the powerful landowners. He saw the injustices that were going on in his society, and he was willing to name them. And he felt called to address the ones in power and to speak against these evils. The prophet Amos, a contemporary of Micah, echoes similar criticisms. Amos writes, I despise your festivals, and I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. Even though you offer me your burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. And the offerings of well-being of your fatted animals I will not look upon. Take away from me the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the melody of your harps. Pretty harsh words. For he was speaking to these people that their acts of worship were not acceptable because they were abusing the court system. Bribes were given and taken by the wealthy to the detriment of the poor. The rich were taking advantage of the poor and unjustly taking away their houses and their vineyards and their way to make life. God was not pleased for these acts of social injustice. Their religious talk was empty because they were not working for the good of the whole community. Their misuse of people, disregard for fairness for all, and perverting the justice system led to a breakdown in the community structure. The people continued to talk the talk in worship while failing to walk the walk outside in the world in relationship to others, particularly those on the outer edges of society. And Amos, like Micah, calls his community to do justice with these familiar words, right? Let justice roll down like the waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. This is what God desires. Do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with your God. To do justice, or as our t-shirts say, another version, to act justly, is not a romantic ideal nor an abstract concept. It means working for fairness and equity within our communities. The biblical concept of justice is pursuing the welfare for the whole community and the individuals in it. It means seeing that the most vulnerable are treated fairly, so that all members of the community can thrive and flourish. The people most associated with needing justice in the Bible are the widows, the fatherless, the orphans, the poor, the hungry, the needy, the stranger, the weak, and the oppressed. The rich and the powerful are not on this list. It is those who are weakest and have the least power that need justice. And it is the responsibility of every member of the community to work for that justice. Acting justly consists of concrete actions of caring and love, helping the poor, supporting widows, serving as advocates for immigrants, opposing those who would take advantage of others, and taking the side of the weak, needy, and most vulnerable. Justice is excruciatingly hard work. It takes time and effort. It asks of us as a people to work together. Justice asks us to see other human beings as God sees them, beloved ones created in God's image, to be treated as God would treat them. It asks us to critique the present unjust systems and to find new alternatives to change these unfair systems. Justice asks us to disrupt, dismantle, and break down systems that are causing inequality. Over the course of history, we see examples of people doing the hard work of justice. Nearly 200 years ago in Charles Dickens's England, many 12-year-old boys were working in the coal mines, down in the cold mine shafts. Their lives were miserable. But that's what was expected of little boys in England at that time. The church offered presents at Christmas time to these boys and their families. They gave them turkeys. The church offered prayers for the little boys working in the mines. The church knew how to show mercy and kindness to those boys. But one day, the law was changed so that those young boys would no longer work in the mines, but could go to school instead. This is justice, working to change the laws so that it is illegal for little boys to work in coal mines. People not just talking the talk, but walking the walk to act justly. In our own history, we know of stories of people rising up to work for justice. Slavery was abolished after years of work by many who lifted up the unjust system that had enslaved people who deserved freedom to live life fully. And we know of the civil rights movement, led by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., advocating for racial equality in our nation, a call for justice for all people, no matter their race, to live life fully. There's still work to be done, for there are still unjust systems out there where people of color are not treated fairly. There are still vulnerable young girls being taken advantage of in the modern day slavery. And organizations like International Justice Mission are working to change lives and rescue those enslaved in the sex trade. There are many people and organizations working for justice. People who are advocating for those who are being treated unfairly. As a Mennonite church, we have done similar things. We have advocated for justice, and we continue to do that in a number of situations and places in the world. And so I just want to point out one recent one, the one that at our denominational convention in Kansas City. At the convention, the delegates passed a resolution on the abuse of child migrants, and this resolution states in part, as a historic peace church, we find the treatment of immigrant families and children at the border, as well as around the nation, a horrific violation of the image of God and God-given rights, human rights. We stand against the traumatic separation of families, the deprivation of basic needs, and the detention of migrants. We condemn the abuse of migrants and call for a change in policy and action by the United States government. Now, this statement is meaningless if we only see it as talking the talk without putting it to action by walking the walk, so that we can indeed do justice. And so the statement also comes along with several items of what things we can do. Some of the things like standing alongside the undocumented members of our churches, seeking connections with immigrant communities, advocating for just and humane policies with our elected officials, and supporting the work of organizations like MCC, who are meeting the basic needs of those incoming migrants. Justice takes courage to step out of our comfort zones and align ourselves with those who need an advocate, someone to walk alongside them, demanding a change in unjust systems, working for the most vulnerable in our society so that they can get their fair share, that they are treated with fairness and equality. Do justice. Love kindness. Now, we all know what kindness is. It's offering compassion and mercy and sympathy and gentleness and helpfulness in our actions to each other. We teach our children kindness in so many ways, offering a smile, a kind word, kind action. We offer kindness to family and to friends and to coworkers and classmates, and sometimes even to strangers, and maybe even to enemies. Remember, Jesus told the story about the Good Samaritan who dared not pass by another human being in need, even when that other was considered an enemy. The others who passed by that man in need had been schooled in the Torah They knew the commandments about offering mercy and love. They could talk the talk, but they were unable to be moved to actually walk the walk, to stop and offer mercy. Only the Samaritan stopped to offer kindness. There is a story told about a class of theological students at Harvard who were preparing for the ministry. These students were taking their final exam on the topic of Kant's moral imperative. Now, Kant was a French philosopher who had this whole theory about how we behave morally. So they were taking the final exam for this class, and they were given 2 hours to write their moral philosophy with a 10-minute break in the middle. So the students wrote furiously for those first 55 minutes, and then the bell rang and they were able to go out, take a break, and go out into the hallway. There in the hallway was another student who was not part of their class, sitting slouched down on the floor, disheveled, looking like a mess. The theological students were busy in their conversations with each other, getting a drink, taking a bathroom break, and into the classroom they returned for the second hour of writing their philosophy of what it meant to be a moral human being. A few weeks later, when the students received their test results, they had all failed. They had thought that their test was what they were writing, all those words on the page. The professor had been standing out in the hallway during the break and was grading them on who approached the man down on the floor and spoke a kind word, and nobody had. They could talk the talk, but they couldn't walk the walk. As simple as it seems to be able to love kindness, it does not always come easily for us. Sometimes we're too busy or too much in a hurry. We get distracted that we don't even notice. Perhaps kindness can be difficult because we must take the risk to be moved, to be vulnerable, and to be able to see another person's suffering as one's own. John Murray, former pastor at Heston Mennonite, shared at convention about his encounter with someone in need on his trip to India. John experienced on this trip culture shock, he says, on many levels, but most profoundly with the beggars he saw. He began to avoid them as best he could, kind of like the priest, he said, in the Good Samaritan story. However, at one point during his visit, the group he was with encountered a paralyzed beggar, and he, as the pastor, was asked to pray for him. He knelt, and John describes it by saying, "For the first time in India, I looked directly in the eyes of someone asking something of me, and what I saw was someone created in the image of God. I saw the Lord, and I was overwhelmed that he could see that I was a child of God as well." Love kindness. And walk humbly with your God. Now, the last 2 Sundays, we've been talking about walking. 2 weeks ago, we looked at what it meant to walk together with other congregations in our wider church body. We considered the importance of being able to embrace our differences and that was a good thing for us to do as we walk together in faithful allegiance to Jesus. And last Sunday, we heard the stories from 4 of our own on their pilgrimage, lessons they learned by walking. And now today, we are encountering this theme once again of walking. So walking implies this journey, putting one foot in front of the other. By walking and not running or skipping or jumping, we move along at a slower, more deliberate pace. It takes conscious effort. It takes action. Walk humbly. Humility meaning not full of yourself, not preoccupied with yourself. Walking humbly is neither having your nose up in the air or your shoulders slouched over your feet. To walk humbly is to not exalt yourself and not to worry or be bothered by others' opinions of you. To walk humbly is not to be above someone or below someone, but rather with someone. It is not thinking you can do it all on your own, carrying the burdens upon your limited human shoulders. It is not forgetting you are human. It is not living without grace. Walking humbly with God is about paying attention and listening to God, paying attention to who we are as beloved children of God, paying attention to God who is walking with us each step of the way, paying attention to those things that are important to God, learning to love others the way God has loved us, opening ourselves to deepen our relationship with God and growing ever more grounded in God's love and mercy. Walking humbly with God means listening, learning to listen to the Spirit of God living within us, learning to listen to God's voice as we listen to the cries and stories of the other human beings, which brings us back to offering kindness and mercy to those in need, to those who are struggling, to those who are living on the edge, to those who are crying out for help, for those trapped in unjust systems, which calls us not just to see the injustice, but be moved into doing something to bring about justice. Do justice, love kindness, walk humbly with your God. These three are not separate actions, but are intertwined together. We cannot do one without the other. It is the linking of great work and action with deep spirituality. Sometimes we start by offering kindness to someone in need. As we develop a relationship with them, we realize that they are being treated unfairly, which leads us to advocate and work for a change in an unjust system. Sometimes, as we are deepening our relationship with God, the Spirit grabs our attention, and we are drawn to look for ways to become involved in offering care and love. Sometimes a justice issue cannot be ignored, and we must act. And as we move forward, our hearts are filled with compassion for those who are suffering. It moves us to continue with courage, knowing that God walks with us. Do justice, love kindness, walk humbly with your God. May God give us deep love to not just talk the talk, but truly walk the walk, so that God's goodness and rightness and beauty and aliveness will flow through us to our world. May it be so.